Imagine receiving a letter from a serial killer, not a confession written years later from a prison cell, not a rumor or a second-hand account. An actual letter from a murderer who is still free, mocking the police, taunting newspapers, and promising that more people will die. Now imagine that more than 50 years later, nobody knows for certain who that killer was. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, one of the most infamous unidentified murderers in American history. A man who transformed fear into a spectacle, who left behind cryptic messages, coded ciphers, and a trail of unanswered questions that continue to fascinate investigators and true crime enthusiasts to this day. What makes the Zodiac case so terrifying is not simply the brutality of the murders. It is the fact that the killer seemed to enjoy the attention. Every letter, every cipher, every threat was designed to remind the public that he was still out there. And despite decades of investigations, thousands of suspects, and advances in forensic science, the identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. The story begins on the evening of December 20th, 1968. On a remote road near Vallejo, California, two teenagers, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, parked their car in a quiet lover's lane known as Lake Herman Road. It was supposed to be a normal Friday night. Instead, it would become the beginning of a nightmare. Sometime between 11 o'clock and 11:15 p.m., an unknown attacker approached the vehicle. David was shot at close range. Betty Lou attempted to flee, but was chased down and shot multiple times. Both teenagers died at the scene. Investigators initially struggled to identify a motive. Nothing appeared to be stolen. There was no obvious connection between the victims and any suspect. At the time, nobody knew this was only the beginning. Less than 7 months later, on July 4th, 1969, another young couple parked in a secluded area known as Blue Rock Springs Park. The victims were 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau. Shortly after midnight, a vehicle pulled up behind them. The driver briefly left, then returned. As Michael later described, the man approached the passenger side carrying a flashlight. At first, they believed he might be a police officer. Then the shooting started. Bullets tore through the vehicle. Darlene was killed. Michael survived despite suffering severe injuries. What happened next shocked investigators even more. About 40 minutes after the attack, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone. In a calm voice, he reported the crime and then confessed to the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen as well. The caller hung up. For the first time, authorities realized they were likely dealing with a serial killer. On August 1st, 1969, 3 newspapers received nearly identical letters. Each letter contained details of the murders that had never been released publicly. The writer claimed responsibility for both attacks. More importantly, he included parts of a coded message. The killer demanded that the newspapers publish the cipher on their front pages. If they refused, he threatened to kill again. The cryptogram consisted of 408 symbols. For days, people across California attempted to solve it. Eventually, a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty managed to crack the code. The message was unsettling. The writer claimed that killing people was more fun than hunting wild game because humans were the most dangerous animals of all. Yet even after solving the cipher, investigators discovered something frustrating. The message contained no name. The killer remained anonymous. A few days later, another letter arrived. This time, the writer opened with words that would become infamous. "This is the Zodiac speaking." For the first time, the killer had given himself a name. The Zodiac Killer had officially entered American history. From that moment forward, every letter, every threat, and every murder would be associated with that chilling title. The attack at Lake Berryessa. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac committed what many consider his most terrifying attack. A young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing near Lake Berryessa. Suddenly, a strange man appeared. Unlike previous attacks, he was wearing an elaborate black executioner's hood. His face was completely concealed. On his chest was a white symbol, a circle crossed by two lines. The Zodiac symbol. The man claimed to be an escaped convict who needed money and a vehicle. The story was a lie. After binding the couple, he began stabbing them repeatedly. Cecilia Shepard suffered numerous wounds and later died. Brian Hartnell survived and provided investigators with one of the most detailed accounts of the killer ever obtained. Before leaving, the Zodiac walked to the victim's vehicle and wrote a chilling message on the door. He listed the dates of his previous attacks and added the new one. It was his way of signing his work. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac struck again. This time, the victim was not a young couple in an isolated location. Instead, it was a San Francisco taxi driver named Paul Stine. Stine picked up a passenger who requested a ride through the city. When they reached their destination, the passenger pulled out a gun and shot him in the head. The killer then calmly removed part of Stine's blood-stained shirt before walking away. Witnesses observed the suspect. Police officers even came dangerously close to catching him. Due to a communication error, responding officers were initially told to search for a black suspect rather than a white one. As a result, the Zodiac slipped away. It remains one of the most frustrating missed opportunities in the entire investigation. Days later, the killer mailed another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stine's shirt. The message proved beyond doubt that the letter writer and the murderer were the same person. By the end of 1969, fear had spread throughout Northern California. People avoided isolated roads. Parents worried about their children. Newspapers covered every Zodiac communication in detail. The killer understood the power he had gained, and he used it. His letters became increasingly bizarre. He threatened school buses. He claimed he would shoot children. He mailed maps and cryptograms. Some messages appeared genuine. Others may have been hoaxes. Investigators were forced to examine every possibility. The Zodiac had become more than a criminal. He had become a public obsession. One of the most fascinating aspects of the case involved the coded messages. The Zodiac seemed fascinated by puzzles and cryptography. Several ciphers were sent to newspapers over the years. One in particular became legendary. Known as the 340 cipher, it contained 340 symbols arranged in a complex pattern. For decades, experts failed to solve it. Some believed it contained the killer's identity. Others thought it was meaningless. Then, in 2020, more than 50 years after it was mailed, an international team of codebreakers finally deciphered it. The solution revealed a disturbing message. The Zodiac mocked authorities and denied fears that he would be captured. Yet once again, he did not reveal his identity. One of the greatest hopes in the investigation ended in disappointment. Over the decades, countless suspects emerged. The most famous was Arthur Leigh Allen. Several pieces of circumstantial evidence appeared to point toward him. He owned a Zodiac-branded watch featuring a symbol similar to the killer's logo. Friends claimed he made disturbing statements. Investigators repeatedly examined him, yet critical evidence never matched. Fingerprints did not conclusively connect him to the crimes. Handwriting comparisons produced conflicting results. DNA evidence failed to provide a definitive answer. Allen died in 1992 without ever being charged. To this day, many people believe he was the Zodiac. Others remain unconvinced. As the years passed, Zodiac communications became less frequent. The murders appeared to stop. The letters gradually ceased. Whether the killer died, was imprisoned for another crime, moved away, or simply chose to stop remains unknown. No one can say with certainty. What is known is that the fear he created never completely disappeared. Investigators continued to receive tips for decades. Books were written, documentaries were produced. Entire communities of amateur detectives dedicated themselves to solving the mystery. Today, more than half a century after the first murders, the Zodiac Killer remains unidentified. The victims have names, families, and stories. The killer has only a symbol, a crosshair inside a circle. That symbol became one of the most recognizable images in true crime history. Perhaps somewhere in an old box of evidence lies the clue that will finally reveal the truth. Perhaps the answer died with the killer years ago. Or perhaps someone, somewhere, still knows exactly who Zodiac was and has never spoken. Until that day comes, the Zodiac Killer remains what he always wanted to be: a mystery. A ghost hiding behind letters and ciphers. A murderer who turned an entire state into his audience and then vanished into history without ever taking off the mask.